Welcome, everybody, to Brussels and outside of Brussels. This is an interesting trial out of a hybrid event. My name is Malena Sell, and I represent Sitra, the Finnish Innovation Fund. And I'm super pleased to be here with you to talk about trade. This event, organized by the Institute for European Environmental Policy, is part of the Green Week here in the EU capital. So part of what's happening around town at different EU institutions. And the topic is making it real. So what we'll be seeing today is how can we make circular economy real globally through our EU trade policy. It's but one element, but it's a super important element. As part of this event, we'll of course be able to take questions in the room, but also through the chat box, which will be up on the Zoom link. So I welcome all of you to participate wherever you are, and would now like to hand over to Mari Pantsar, who's the Director of Sustainability Solutions at Sitra. And Mari will give us the background and some inspirational thoughts for the event today. Thank you, Mari. I'll head over to the chair and okay. Welcome you to the podium.
So thank you so much, Malena, and ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues and friends. So I'm saying it is really a great pleasure to be here in Brussels, and especially being here in person in this hybrid event, which is focusing on how the EU trade policy can support the global transition towards the circular economy. So as we all know, the world is living through very challenging times. And at Sitra, we did talk about triple crisis even before 2020. So we know that climate change, biodiversity loss, and overconsumption of natural resources pose a great threat to, of course, the whole planet and also well-being for people. And two more crises have become inescapable since 2020, namely a pandemic and also a war in Europe. And when we are taking all this into account, so I believe that we all need hope more than ever. And in my opinion, the circular economy solutions more than ever can be a source of hope. And also it should be the effort where we focus all our energy on. And therefore, I am so happy to be in this event where we can discuss how the EU can work with the trade partners to advance the circular economy and bring hope to the world, and how we can do this together. So Sitra, the Finnish Innovation Fund, is very much about listening. It is very much about sharing and also taking collective action. And this has been our approach also to the circular economy from the very beginning. So for example, we have been leading the work for preparation of Finland's circular economy roadmap in 2016. And in that process, we brought together stakeholders from different sectors of the Finnish society to create a new vision. And it is a vision that has something in it for all. It has something for the school children, it has something for the local governments, politicians, and also to small and large companies. And for example, in Finland today, the principles of the circular economy are taught at all education levels, and also thousands of Finnish companies have applied Sitra's circular economy playbook in order to develop their own circular business models and businesses. And at the global level, we have also been applying these same principles of inclusiveness and also dialogue, and we have created the World Circular Economy Forum concept, and it has now been running since 2017. And actually many of you have participated in and partnered with us in these events, and I am very grateful for that. And of course, special thanks to Josh and the Ellen MacArthur Foundation. And in December this year, we are going to have the next World Circular Economy Forum in Rwanda, and it is the first African WCF. And trade will be one of the key themes. And I would like very much to see so many of you there or online again. And on the trade side, the interest in and understanding of circular economy has grown really tremendously over the last few years. I was at the World Trade Organization in 2018. And I was speaking at the first ever panel organized on the topic by Finland at the WTO Public Forum. And since then, the circular economy has been widely discussed and experiences have been shared between both developing and developed countries at the WTO and also beyond. And the EU, which is the global leader in the circular economy through the Circular Economy Action Plan and the Green Deal, is logically a leader also in circular trade. In fact, Circular Economy Action Plan from 2020 spells very clearly out that the EU needs to integrate circular economy into its trade policy. And in order to help this work, Sitra, we joined forces with European Environmental Policy and the Ellen MacArthur Foundation to explore the topic more deeply. And we believe that the EU policy on trade and circular economy can also serve as a laboratory for how to integrate circular economy into trade policy more broadly and globally. And from the beginning, this project was guided by a fantastic steering group which has representatives from a number of organizations with deep knowledge of both trade and also circular economy, including the OECD, UNCTAD, Tier Fund, IISD, Chatham House, and the Finnish government and the Finnish Confederation of Industries. And I am so grateful for all the contributions that the steering committee members have made. So a warm thank you for that. And during this 2-year journey, much has happened. The pandemic hit at the planning stages already, which meant that the first report focused on the impact on trade and circularity of the pandemic in itself, including recommendations for sustainable recovery measures. In addition, the whole project turned online, which is of course, or was not of course, the original intent. The explicit goal of the project has been to move to a more concrete level through case studies. And ideally, we would have met in person, but luckily we all adapted and managed to hold these meetings virtually. The case study countries and trade arrangements were selected with the support of the steering committee, and they include 4 very different countries: China, Canada, Nigeria, and Mercosur. And following my opening speech, the IEEP will give more details on the project case studies, outcomes, and learnings, and you will have an opportunity to discuss these in further detail. And from the Sitra side, it has been important to get a deeper understanding of how the different cases also open up different kind of opportunities for circular trade. And cooperation can focus on diverse issues, such as on the technical development of circular standards that help implement the EU Sustainable Product Policy Initiative, or on getting businesses together through circular economy missions, or on ensuring that policies on waste and plastic are mutually beneficial, or on technology trade. So there is really no one-size-fits-all solution. And it is very important to really make the most of opportunities to convene the partner countries, to listen to what matters from the grassroots up to support a fair and sustainable transition where circular companies can thrive. So ladies and gentlemen, dear friends, so today Sitra will also have another event here in Brussels where we discuss the results of our latest study, which is the first quantitative analysis globally on how much the circular economy can halve biodiversity loss. And we have done this study together with Vivid Economics, an organization that has provided data for the Dasgupta report. And I can tell you in advance that the circular economy is not only a powerful tool in climate mitigation, but the circular economy is also a very, very powerful tool in halting nature loss. So this actually means that we have most of the solutions to tackle both climate crisis, biodiversity loss, and of course, overconsumption of natural resources. We just have to implement these solutions and scale them up, and we have to do this fast. But when we have the circular economy in the very core of these solutions, I believe that at the same time, we can build also more resilient economies. So with these remarks, I will hand over to the moderator, the presenters and panelists, and I wish that we will have very active debate in this event. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Mari, for setting the scene. And really with that, I think I'll hand over directly to the presenters at the IEEP, who will give us more detail and then open up a discussion with panelists as well as the audience. So we have our IEEP experts here, Antoine Auger, Eline Blot, and Emma Watkins. So the floor is yours. I'm really looking forward to hearing more.
Thank you, Malena. I hope the microphone is working properly. So good morning, everyone, and welcome to our event. Thank you for those who made it out here in person on this extraordinary day in Brussels. As Malena mentioned, I'm Elena, and I'm joined by my colleagues Antoine and Emma from the Institute for European Environmental Policy. So today we'll be discussing a project that's been in the works for a while. It's namely trade in support of circular economy. And with this presentation, we'll be going over the context in which we conducted this study. We'll also take a look at the methodology on how we selected our case study countries. Then we'll go over some general findings that we had across case studies. And then finally, we'll conclude by looking at some key sectors relevant to the circular economy that we've selected from our case study countries. So first, I'd like to highlight the context in which we conducted this study. On one hand, as I'm sure you're aware, the EU has set in motion several environmental policy initiatives under the EU Green Deal, such as the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, the Deforestation-Free Supply Chains Initiative, and most importantly to this project, the Circular Economy Action Plan. Recently published is a very comprehensive proposal on the Sustainable Products Initiative, which is a very important aspect of the Circular Economy Action Plan, which aims at ensuring that goods sold on the EU market are more durable, are more reliable, repairable, recyclable, sustainable. You get the idea. On the other hand, the EU has announced its plans to strengthen its compliance framework through two channels. The first being through the new environmental and human rights due diligence, as well as corporate social responsibility legislations. So these are two legislations that aim to hold corporations accountable for violations in human and labor rights throughout supply chains, as well as failures to protect the environment. The EU wishes to also strengthen its compliance framework through a second channel, namely through a more proactive stance in enforcing its trade rules as laid out in its bilateral trade agreements. The EU has taken steps to do this by appointing the Chief Trade Enforcement Officer, as well as launching the Single Entry Points platform for complaints on violations related to the trade and sustainable development chapters and market access issues. So why is this all relevant to trade? Well, taken together, these new environmental policies paired with a strengthened compliance framework risk increasing barriers to trade by setting new requirements for goods sold on the EU market. So that means goods entering the market will need to adhere to new standards and or certification on imports, as well as market access restrictions for unsustainably sourced products. The strengthened compliance framework aims to ensure that these new standards are delivering the promises and objectives of the EU Green Deal. So in order to reduce these barriers to trade, the impacts of these environmental policies, we do believe that the EU must pursue enhanced cooperation and exchanges with its key trade partners to ensure that the implications of its domestic environmental policies have a minimal effect on trade and sustainable development for third countries. Just a quick word also on why the EU is actually pushing forward these unilateral measures or autonomous measures, as we call them. This has more so to do with a kind of blockade that's been apparent at the WTO for several years now. There's a lot of style dialogue on environment. We do see there's some progress happening right now, On the other hand, bilaterally, the EU is also pushing for more sustainable trade agreements, but there's quite a big time gap between, negotiating a trade agreement, finding compromises, and then finalizing the trade agreement and being able to enforce these trade rules. So in recognizing this, the EU has, according to their trade policy review, taken a more assertive stance to actually push for its values in terms of what kind of sustainable goods they want to see on their markets. So that highlights the context of this project. A quick word on methodology on how we selected our case study countries. Firstly, we took a look at the EU's bilateral trade flows and looked at the EU's top trade partners in these kinds of circular economy relevant supply chains and sectors. Then, based on those sectors, we took a look at which country is trading in a circular economy relevant sector and how important is that sector for that country's sustainable development and national economy. We also took a look at how what the potential for circularity for those supply chains are, because obviously some lean more into circular economy principles than others. And then finally, we also took into account the engagement of EU trade partner countries in circular economy initiatives at the start. So this narrowed down our selection to, as Mari mentioned, Canada, China, Mercosur, and Nigeria. Our case studies were conducted on the basis of interviews with domestic stakeholders and experts, as well as desk-based research and dialogues such as the one you're at today. Right, so I'll give a few, some general findings from across our case studies before we head into the sector-specific findings. And we have three main takeaways. The first one being that circular economy is generally not explicitly mentioned in the EU's existing trade frameworks. So, we took a look at the EU-Canada trade agreement, the CETA, and we noticed, there is no explicit mention of circular economy, but there are, references to circular economy principles. So that's not to say that there is nothing about circular economy in existing trade frameworks. It's just, it hasn't been made explicit yet, or it hasn't really reached, the ambition that we see with the Circular Economy Action Plan. However, that is not to say that the EU does not pursue environmental cooperation through other avenues. So we did find that the EU is active on bilateral and multilateral levels to discuss, circular economy and other environmental sustainability related issues. And it's also engaged in technical cooperation efforts with its trade partners. And then a final finding is that we noticed that circular economy related cooperation approaches do differ between developed and developing countries. So when we're looking at, two developed countries cooperating on circular economy, we notice that the focus is more on the product design issues, the more upstream part of the supply chain. Whereas when the cooperation is between a developed country and a developing country, the focus there is more so on, introducing extended producer responsibility or introducing better waste management regulations. So the focus is more concentrated on the downstream and how to better control downstream impacts of the supply chain. That brings me to the introduction of our sector-specific part of the presentation. I'm almost done speaking, but I just wanted to give a quick overview of where the EU is at in terms of raw materials. This is something that's quite important in the current geopolitical context. As you may know, raw materials encompasses trade in metals, minerals, rubber, wood, paper, textiles, as well as animal and vegetable raw materials. As you can see on this graph, EU's trade in raw materials over the past 20 years has tripled. So it's quite significant at this point. We know that on one hand, China is a main destination for the EU's produced raw materials, while on the other hand, the EU is importing most of its raw materials from countries such as Brazil and Canada. We'd also like to note that the metals, minerals, and rubber section of raw materials actually makes up about half of EU imports. So it's quite a significant proportion that EU's importing from other countries. So this actually brings us to my colleague Antoine, who will be presenting findings on from the case studies on raw materials and e-waste. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Eline, for this global introduction to our projects and our main findings. And thank you very much to you for being here today, especially special thanks to the Ellen MacArthur Foundation and to Sitra for this wonderful collaboration throughout this almost 2 years now project that is coming to an end. So now that Elina has given you a broad overview of what this project was all about and the kind of general findings that we could get to, now we're going to get into a bit more details, to a little bit more scrutiny, and starting with this on these sectors of raw materials, continuing on these sectors of raw material. So as Elina just mentioned before, so these standards put forward as part of the Circular Economy Action Plan will affect how certain goods, and in particular how certain raw materials, will be recovered, reused, recycled in the EU, but also globally. And this is particularly relevant for the sourcing of critical raw materials which are necessary for the climate change, fight against climate change and the circular economy transition, the production of green technologies such as solar panels, wind turbines, electric vehicles, and the like. So this brings up the need for resilience in the supply chains, and the resilience in the supply chain of raw materials in particular, not only vital to meet society's basic needs, but also just simply to fight the climate, to address the climate crisis. So now that we have this picture, so how's the EU trade framework? Because we're talking about trade and circularity here. How can the EU trade framework support this sustainable sourcing of raw material? So, as Elina mentioned, the EU has not been stagnant when it comes to actions on the new raw materials. In 2020, the EU announced its action plan on critical raw material, which aims to secure a sustainable supply of raw materials by reducing reliance on primary raw material, diversifying and strengthening the sourcing of raw materials, and as well as formalizing international avenues for cooperation. And we're going to mention a few now. So this action plan seeks in particular to set out some strategic partnerships with resource-rich countries, which are of course critical in the supply chains, such as Canada, we've mentioned, Australia, we have Norway, we have Ukraine as well, and several countries in Africa and South America, which we'll get into more details as well. So looking at the EU's relationship with Canada in particular, as we mentioned, Canada is one of the case studies that we've developed as part of this project. So Canada is a key supplier of raw material to the EU. So as we've mentioned, we found that the CETA, the trade agreement between the EU and Canada, does not formally mention circular economy, and yet that it did include a provision facilitating bilateral dialogues on raw materials. And this provided a mandate, now that we're in implementation phase, to launch the EU-Canada Strategic Partnership on raw materials. And this highlights how trade agreements can still foster, incentivize, and support bilateral environmental cooperation. When looking at another of our case study, looking at Mercosur, we came into the array of a vast array of initiatives on circular bioeconomy. So, although again, not formally mentioned in the free trade agreement, which is itself not ratified as yet, as you know. So we've had to go through other avenues again. So by circular bioeconomy, we're talking about involves the primary producers, processors, retailers, and the like of biomass, bio-based products, which can be food, feed, fuels, and raw materials. So again, this biomass that we consider as a renewable resources, in that it can be regrown, yes, but assuming that land, water, and other basic commodities, nutrients are available to do so. And this is a crucial point, because bioeconomy has been considered for a while, including by the EU, more on the downstream aspect of it, of how the consumption of biomass could be done. And we found that this was a bit of a restricted view of circular bioeconomy, and a more holistic approach that we argue we could move forward to would integrate as well the upstream aspect of bioeconomy, which includes the production of biomass and the availability of land to do so sustainably. So we know that the EU has been going toward that direction, at least internally, with the new LULUCF revision that is ongoing and so like. And so now we hope that this movement will continue. And the EU trade policy should also be part of this picture. And it can support this adoption of appropriate standards when we talk about the production of sustainable biomass across the globe, not only in the EU, but the trade framework are designed to do so as well in supply regions across the world. So this idea of trade in biomass, trade in sustainable biomass combined with sustainable land use policies globally would support what we call an emerging sustainable circular bioeconomy. So this was quite clear in our Mercosur study. So going to another one of our case study, and another sector that we found was quite significant was between the EU and Nigeria and based on e-waste. So first of all, to mention that following the streams of bans of waste import that has been initiated by China in 2017, non-OECD developing countries have been more and more on the receiving end of waste export from developed economies, including the EU, and including on e-waste. And we have now Nigeria ranking among the world's leading destination for electronic waste with close to 60,000 tons per year, which is of course extremely more than significant. We also found out that most of the provenance of this e-waste are developed economies, such as the UK, Germany, and Belgium as well. So when conducting the number of interviews with stakeholders in Canada and in the region, it was clear that the main challenges are quite well identified, quite clear. We have a lack of capacity of the public sector and of the private and formal sector to process the waste and the e-waste. So this is combined, of course, with the importance of the informal sector, which brings issues such as unsafe practices. We have monitoring difficulties, and of course, public health, dangerous situations, direct pollution of their environment, etc., etc. So, and last but not least, we found out that there is a very, very significant lack of awareness and stakeholder engagement in this circular economy transition and opportunities. And again, that brings about some issues such as from a public health perspective. People are not aware of the risk associated with informal sector picking up waste and e-waste. And that has been quite clearly mentioned by all actors we've talked to. So as Eline mentioned, circular economy in developing economies in general and in Nigeria in particular, because this, of course, we've had some more focus there. Circular economy is quite at an early stage in terms of policy framework, relying mostly on extended producer responsibility programs, including on e-waste in Nigeria. There is one EPR for that in Nigeria, but what the country is lacking and is in the actually at the moment developing is a national policy framework to bring about this circular economy transition from a more holistic perspective. And that's not only for support for development of a structured closed loop for waste management, what we talked about in particular about waste, but also quite very, very important to bring about the profitability of circular economy related value chains in the country. That is how we're going to get more public involvement. This is how we're going to get more awareness raising, etc., etc., etc. So this is also very important. So again, two different aspects. One, more on the short term to have this closed loop waste management issue. And second, to increase the profitability of circular economy value chains, brings up the need to have a national policy framework in the country. Looking ahead, what the EU can do and what the trade framework with the EU in particular can do to address this situation. We have a few recommendations, let's say, to make. I'm sure you're aware. First one is the monitoring of EU waste experts. I mean, secondary raw material recovered from waste have a potential for economic opportunities, but that will be very much depend on the quality of these materials. And so, of course, the EU can and should play a role here into monitoring the quality of its waste export and what kind of waste it exports to developing economies. So the EU has done has launched some initiative in that regard. Lastly, in last November, with the waste export initiative that will be discussed in the coming year before being enacted. And so the monitoring, the implementation of that particular regulation will be very, very important. We have some trade policy measures. We're talking about trade here. So Nigeria currently trades with the EU under the GSP, the Generalized Scheme of Preference, that is a preferential system which removes import duties from a large selection of products coming into the EU market. and that's supporting export potential in developing economies. So what we found out is, again, so circular economy is not very well infused in that particular scheme, at least formally. And also, when looking particularly at Nigeria, it has so far quite failed to address the very much oil dependency that defines EU-Nigeria trade relations at the moment. However, trade options, trade measures, specific trade measures are still an option for Nigeria to develop its circular economy aspects. We mentioned a couple here. So we have first and foremost definition and monitoring. So Nigeria could define the restriction on type of imported waste that it would allow to enter in the country. That could be based on recyclability standards, for instance. And it could upgrade the border post operation to monitor, to filter the kind of waste that it lets enter into the country. And that we have the WTO trade facilitation agreement also that can facilitate. That involves a lot of cooperation in that particular regard. A second one would be simply to facilitate the import of relevant goods, to identify the type of products, technologies, even waste that it requires to advance both the upstream and downstream aspect of circular economy in the country, and in general, and in e-waste management in particular, and set its external tariff accordingly in the context of the common external tariff of the ECOWAS region, because you know that Nigeria is part of the ECOWAS that has that external tariff. So there could be that conversation. A third one, of course, where the EU has a tremendous role to play is the technical cooperation in terms of capacity building and, what we mentioned before, raising awareness. So now that we've entered into the new multi-annual financial framework, 2021-2027, circular economy, which again is a relatively new concept and was not present in the previous one, in the previous multi-annual financial framework. It now is. It's there. And so we're in the identification formulation phase of technical cooperation projects between the EU and Nigeria. And we've been discussing with the EU delegation in Lagos, and they confirmed that some technical projects specifically designed to support the circular economy transition in the country are in the pipeline. They are going to be put up for the next year. So of course, this cooperation is absolutely crucial. Last but not least, but I will mention just a few words on that, is the new business models for circular economy. So innovation, new business models, service-intensive business opportunities are absolutely crucial, and especially in the developing economic context. But on this, we have Dr. Ndidi in the panel, who I'm sure will be very more than happy to discuss these issues. And we will also have our panelist, Jasper, from the industry point of view, who will tell us more about that. I'm now passing the floor to our new panelist, Emma Watkins from IEEP, who will talk more about the EU-China case study that's been done with the Ellen MacArthur Foundation, and talking more specifically about plastic. Thank you, Emma.
Thank you very much. Hopefully the microphone is working okay. Good. And please forgive me, those in the room, if I turn slightly to my side and don't look at you too much. It's a bit of a tricky physical situation. So I've been looking at the China case study with support from the Ellen MacArthur Foundation. Why did we choose China? Obviously, China and the EU are both huge players on the global trade. Between them, they in 2020 accounted for around 1/3 of global exports and over 1/4 of global imports. So they're very important trading partners. Yeah, perfect. And we chose to look at plastics. Obviously, it's a very big environmental issue. I'll just carry on. It's a very big environmental issue in terms of plastic pollution. And also the global trade in plastics is also a very huge amount. It accounts for around $1 trillion US of trade per year, and about 5% of the total trade in merchandise globally. So it's a very big part of the global trade markets. Talking about plastic goods, the EU imported over 9 billion euros worth of Chinese plastic goods in 2021, but trade in plastics isn't just to do with the actual finished goods and materials, it's also to do with trade in waste, which obviously is environmentally a big issue. Before the Chinese ban on imports of plastic waste in 2018, a huge percentage of EU plastic waste that was collected for recycling was actually exported to China to be dealt with over there. following the implementation of that ban, that basically disappeared, that trade in plastic waste. So it fell from its peak of $750 million worth in 2014 to only $1 million worth in 2020 after the ban was put into place. So the ban itself was obviously very effective. Yes, and just also in terms of the kind of context that we're working in, both the EU and China are pursuing very wide-ranging policies to address plastic pollution. There are quite a few similarities, actually, we've found while doing the case study. For example, looking at restrictions and bans for particular types of products, so thin plastic bags. A lot of single-use plastic items are banned or about to be banned in China and the EU. And also microbeads in personal care products are banned in both. Both have objectives to greatly increase recycling of plastics, to reduce final disposal, and also to pursue cleanup of plastics that have already made their way into the environment. And one of the main differences that we've found is that the EU is set to pursue the inclusion of more recycled content, in particular in plastic packaging, as part of the review of the packaging directive. And China is yet to kind of pursue increasing the use of recycled content in its plastic products. So there's a bit of a discrepancy there. So looking ahead on what can be done in terms of promoting more sustainable plastic trade globally, there are a couple of very interesting ongoing international initiatives. The first is the IDP, which is the Informal Dialogue on Plastics Pollution and Environmentally Sustainable Plastics Trade. So it's good, they've given it a very short acronym. That involves so far 71 World Trade Organization members, including both China and the EU. And the aim of the IDP is to better understand the role that trade policy can play in addressing the global plastics challenge. The IDP is going to aim to develop better monitoring of trade flows in plastics, also look at the impact of subsidies on plastic pollution, try to promote markets for reprocessing of plastics, so plastics recycling, and also alternatives to plastic products. And it's also going to look at the role of standards and regulations in sustainable trade. And then UNEA 5, just a couple of months ago, there was a resolution adopted by 175 countries, so pretty much global support, to negotiate a new binding international agreement to end plastic pollution. The aim is to have that agreement in place by 2024, and the negotiations will start in the second half of this year, so it's quite an ambitious timescale. The aim is to address the full plastics life cycle, so across the whole value chain, and basically the aim is to reduce plastic leakage to the environment. The agreement, when it's ready, is likely to include measures related to reporting on plastic pollution, so we can better kind of trace where pollution comes from, where it ends up, what we can do about it. It should also include some compliance mechanisms for signatories to make sure that they're fulfilling their obligations. It's also going to look at creating an enabling environment for a new plastics economy, which may include some aspects related to trade. And also look at considering financing options, in particular for developing countries to fulfill their objectives through the agreement. So just to finish up with some ideas on how to facilitate more sustainable trade in plastics. Obviously, the alignment of policy objectives between trading partners helps. If you're aiming in the same direction for circularity, for restrictions of various types of products, and for increasing recycling, then that creates a good framework to work within. And then 2 points on standards. The first is relating to standards for treatment of plastic waste. So there it's helpful to have common, or at least commonly understood, definitions of what is plastic waste and what's secondary material, so that you're very clear about what you're shipping and who's shipping it, who's receiving it. And also ensuring that the standards of recycling infrastructure and treatment of plastic waste are to a good enough level to be kind of sustainable. And then finally, the last point is on product standards. So obviously this is a huge issue for trade. To have access to markets, you need to meet certain standards. They could relate to choice of materials, It could also relate to aspects such as recyclability of materials. So what can happen to those materials once they reach the end of their life? Are they recyclable? And also going back to the previous point on recycled content, perhaps if the EU sets specific targets for the amount of recycled content in products, then those will have to be met also by trading partners in the future. And I think that's it for me for now. Thank you.
So thank you so much to the team from IEEP. We've learned a lot and we have a lot of information coming in that we'll now get a chance to process. But first of all, I'd just like to ask whether there are some questions from the floor at this point, some clarifications that you might like to have from the studies themselves, or of course from the stream also. Great, so.
I'm Enrique Passini, UNCTAD. My question goes to Helene, I think, on the case of Nigeria. I think you mentioned briefly that you witnessed, or was it they witnessed some pattern in circularity relationships between developed countries where cooperation goes on the upstream, and when the case is between the developed and developing country, the cooperation goes to the downstream. I'd like you to elaborate on that, just some examples, because this pattern that you observed interests my work a lot. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Enrique, and thank you for being here. So yes, indeed, this is something that we found when looking at particular trade relations between the EU and some of its trade partners, especially when looking at with the developed economies. We saw a lot of cooperation when it comes to product design. This is also one of the focus of the EU with the new initiatives that was launched back in March. And so indeed, more of this upstream aspect, product design, where how to produce to increase the recyclability, reusability of products when it's based on the similar products that are exchanged between developed economies. So this is also something that we've seen with Canada. When looking at Nigeria, we found much less of these concrete examples. Also again, because what I've said is that the EU and Nigeria trade relationship is defined mostly by oil product, with more than 80% of the trade value between the EU and Nigeria being oil-related products. So of course, that is a different trade relations altogether. But we found very little of these kind of particular concrete examples on product design and standards essentially happening there. Whereas a lot of the focus that we found was on waste management issues, essentially to improve the waste management capacities of Nigeria. So that is for me to formalize the informal sector there, again, from a public health and environmental degradation perspective, and simply to increase capacity of the public sector and the formal private sector to actually process this, to integrate these waste and process them. I wanted to mention something about this. Yeah, this will come back to me. But yes, indeed, and yes, cooperation. And in terms of cooperation, so between the EU and Nigeria, as I said, we're in a new era with this new multilateral financial framework, and we saw written in the text this kind of cooperation on downstream happening still, but also now getting into the upstream. And that is the encouraging thing, that a point that I would like to make as well, is that, for instance, is a new currently the EU is supporting the African Development Bank as well, are supporting the National Circular Economy Working Group in Nigeria that is in the process of elaborating this national policy framework that I was mentioning. So, which would bring about a much more holistic approach to circular economy in the country, not only to waste management. So, in the past, concrete focus on more downstream aspect of circular economy, but we see a shift at least in terms of formal cooperation toward a more holistic approach to circular economy between the EU and Nigeria. So hopefully that will continue and be reinforced.
Thank you, Antoine. That's very useful. And now we will switch panels and move from the IEEP side to our commentary speakers. So I welcome you to take your spots by the small tables here. We will have Jasper Bleriot, who's the executive lead on international institutions and governments at the Ellen MacArthur Foundation, as well as Dr. Ndidi Nnoli-Edozien, who will join us online. So we'll meet her in a little while. Then we have Indre Vaicekauskaite, who joins us from DG Trade, where she functions as Trade and Sustainable Development Officer. And we have Jasper Munier, who works at NWE Claritor and representing the private sector and bringing some very concrete examples as well of how circularity is happening. So we'll have a round of questions. We'll then open to the floor and continue. And I'll start with Joss. And now that you've heard, all of this information come in, and also being aware of the current geopolitical situation, do you see that the current pressure on raw materials is something that actually could be leveraged into a bold move to strengthen circularity and resource efficiency? And how could different countries on different parts of the global value chains find their roles in this context? So a little bit of, where are we at today and what are some opportunities for circularity?
Thank you, Malena, for the very unchallenging question. Basically, you want me to give a state of play in geopolitics pertaining to materials. Yeah, sounds about right.
Like that.
I think, well, first of all, I'd like to thank the IEEP and Sitra for this excellent collaboration. And Mari, you alluded to the fact that the first panel at the WTO back in 2018, I think we were all part of it. Enrique was part of it as well. And that led from one tiny panel, the emergence of the topic in the discussion, to a few studies, to this group, to a real body of knowledge that emerged as a result. And we're pursuing that effort. And I think it's really fascinating to see. Now, one thing that the current situation has put back on the map is, of course, the notion of sovereignty, that notion of supply safety, which actually, if you look back to the very first circular economy action plan of the EU, was really at the heart of what it was trying to do as well. And if you look at what China is doing with their circular economy policy as well, is to secure the resource base. So there's a double edged aspect to circular economy. One is securing the supply side and also reducing the environmental impact. And that was true in the case of China, that's true in the case of the EU. So of course, with the current tension on the geopolitical stage, that notion is coming back, and we see it notably when it comes to agricultural policy. That notion of food sovereignty is extremely prevalent. So of course, that creates a different dynamic, and it is an incentive to circularize the resource base, create potentially more domestic circular loops when it comes to materials management, which, by the way, is also supported by a raft of services. And you can count remanufacturing, you can count logistics, you can count materials management in a very broad sense. So it's not only a question of how do we actually deal with volumes, it's how you move them around, what you do with them, what value gets derived at what stage. And you can really create those local loops for sure. And we've seen it in COVID as well. The supply shock was quite important, and who was resilient in terms of local availability of feedstocks, their way to reprocess it. If you have spare parts, or you can create spare parts for machinery that you desperately need, then of course that's a resilience aspect, and it creates a local economy. But at the same time, we have a global situation whereby 70% of trade stitches together value chains across borders. So you have service, you have exports of materials. So 70% of the trade is actually, interestingly, very, very dependent on value chains that are integrated and that span across borders. So sometimes there's a tension between how do you derive your GDP? Is it from selling the raw materials to other countries, being a net exporter? And within that category, there are also different types of countries. So Canada has a high income country that depends massively on raw material exports, but they also have the investment capacity to fund some of that transition. Not all countries that export raw materials have that luxury. Some of them really depend on those raw material exports in order to simply sustain their economy. And then circularity can become, for them, a bit of a threat. So there are pockets of innovation, pockets of opportunity, of course. And I think to conclude for this specific question, which again was quite challenging, thank you for that, Malena. It's important to show, as the OECD has done, that there's a discrepancy between the trade policies and the circular economy policies, or at the very least, they're not joined up. We should join them up, definitely. We should also look at circular economy elements that can be put into specific sectoral applications, and we've seen it with plastics, thanks to Emma. We need also to address the lack of definition and common standards, and to a certain extent, some efforts have been started. I'm thinking about the technical committee on in the ISO work, TC 323, which potentially will give some sort of standardization, and at the very least take the discussion between circular economy and trade to a place where there is a common language and we speak about the same thing.
Thank you so much, Joss. And you brilliantly answered this very, very difficult question. So that sets us to a good start here. And indeed, I think you're highlighting how different the situation is now compared to 2 years ago, or a little bit more than 2 years ago when we got started. And there are opportunities to really grasp the key relevance of circularity in a different way in this new context, even though there are the tensions and challenges as well. Now we'll move to Dr. Ndidi Nnoli-Edozien, and you're so welcome to join us here. It would have been, of course, lovely to have you here in person as well. But one of the case studies was Nigeria, and you've been very involved in that from your own side and your own context as well. So e-waste is one of the biggest challenges that we face globally today, and that's something that you see firsthand. So on the one hand, there are obviously negative impacts on sustainability, but then there are also new business opportunities. So could you share your perspective on this? Where do you see business opportunities, and what is needed to make those business opportunities fly?
Thank you very much. Just to check in, can you hear me?
Yes, very well.
Brilliant. Okay, you'll notice I'm on the screen 3 times because the network's been funny today. So if this breaks off, I have another one and I will switch to voice to that immediately. It's a great question regarding opportunities. First of all, thank you for this session. Thank you for continuing this dialogue, and thank you also for bringing Africa and Nigeria specifically into the dialogue. In terms of opportunities on this end, you probably already know that we have a place in Nigeria called the Computer Village, which is the largest tech accessory market on the African continent. It's already been mentioned as well that we're the second largest destination on the one hand for consumer goods after Ghana, and the second recipient, if you like, of e-waste on the African continent after Egypt. So certainly in terms of evaluating the ecosystem and understanding, does Nigeria have relevance? That's certainly the case. What we have done here is we have started, so again, we've worked, and I want to commend on the one hand, Sitra, who I know is at the table, because they were one of the partners that we first worked with on this. And it's been very positive, at least since I've been actively involved in the CE space in Nigeria, to see that working with different jurisdictions, so in this instance, it was Finland and Germany and the Dutch, that there's been collaboration and there's been a lot of listening as well in terms of the approach that we've opted for in terms of incorporating circular economy. And of course, there are 3 different levels. So the first is the level of actually policies and regulation. And so taking Lagos State, which is Africa's most populous city, into cognizance, we created something called Circular Lagos, which meant that, first of all, because there are various different angles on circularity, how do you actually create the opportunities across the different businesses and across the different industries? And how do you ensure that you actually create a space whereby you're not just creating regulations that are fining or putting in punitive measures, but are actually also incentivizing the creation of business models, new business models. And I'll speak and I'll end with that question, brilliant question of upstream and downstream engagement. Second is the big question of how do you ensure, one, that you're closing the loop on circularity, so you're actually not just addressing a symptom, but you're actually going to the cause and building new business models and creating new jobs and new businesses around the opportunities that circularity brings. And more importantly, how do you ensure that this is profitable? Because you can't really do this from a development aid, which is why this conversation is so apt. It's really about trade, it's about business, because otherwise you can't scale and you can't get to that point that you want to. And that leads us to one of the first few problems, actually, and that's the problem of data. When you talk about monitoring what comes in from the EU, for instance, to Nigeria or other African countries, how are you, or even companies actually, how are you actually monitoring that? Because one of the weaknesses on this end is actually availability of and integrity of that data that's being monitored and measured. And it's not enough to just measure it from the European side, it also needs to be tracked on the ground over here. The second is when you spoke about technical assistance or technical support or inputs in the presentation earlier. What's very, very also important is that that's geared towards ensuring that one can achieve scale and one can actually also achieve investment. Because running it as an initiative that is supposed to work only downstream, namely what has been highlighted as waste management, health and safety, capacity to process challenges, doesn't really get to the meat of the issue. We actually need to get to the point where we're closing the loop and where the businesses are being re-engineered and they're using their local waste. And I saw a question in the chat that really asked the question on e-waste trade with 3 question marks. How is it possible that so much e-waste is essentially shipped off to Nigeria, and what does that mean? Especially because a lot of the time you'll find, and I'll give the example here, I'll shift slightly to plastics, which is what we decided to use as our first use case. In the plastics sector, what we first of all started doing was working with the regulators and working with the regulators locally, so that it's not just there is going to be an EPR and the fines for not recycling your plastics is X, but rather how do you look at the supply chain? And this is where it speaks also to supply chain resilience. How do you look at the entire supply chain and identify where the gaps are and what needs to be addressed? And how do you incentivize investment, which will not entirely be here? It's actually a huge opportunity also for the EU, because of a lot of the technology, there's no point in reinventing that. There are a lot of the technology already exists, a lot of the business opportunities already exist, and there are huge opportunities there for not just encouraging trade across borders, but also encouraging investment between borders. And of course, my former boss once said Nigeria is Africa's or the world's best kept secret, because once you do get into Nigeria and understand the sheer size of the opportunity and the sheer size of the economy and the enterprise and the drive, then you really can't keep away from it, because there's so much potential for growth. What's really exciting, and the reason why I got so engaged with circular economy is simply because, as a sustainability expert, what circular economy does is addresses the question of addressing environmental damage, health and safety, social and economic impact with climate action. So you're not just actually trying to solve problems, you're also actively creating opportunities and addressing gaps and promoting trade and promoting new business models and actually getting to things at the very core. And that leads me to a story, which is interestingly neither an e-waste or a plastic story, but it's a story of 10 years ago that never left me. And it was a very, very high level meeting between governments, which I was privileged to be at. And one of the very senior government officials was an agriculturist prior to that. And he told the story of how he produced, and indeed he did produce at the time at least, Nigeria's best mangoes, the sweetest, the biggest, and the most beautiful. And he had great plans about exporting those to Europe because there was demand. And he actually did all the effort, and according to his own end, felt that quality control was way above Nigerian standards. And he shipped those mangoes, and he said he ended up throwing all of them, although it sounds like a horror story, they were all essentially dumped. He jokes and he says they were dumped into the water, but I think they were dumped otherwise. But the point is, that was a huge business that went into the dump simply because certification and the requirements for import-export were not aligned. Just to speak to the last speaker's point about the fact that we need to standardize the measures, but also standardize the certification requirements, etc., and that those will vary across jurisdictions. And so it makes absolute sense that the conversations between, you know, the global north versus the conversations between the global south and the global north are actually differentiated between the upstream, which has more to do with product design and improving reusability and you know, getting to the core of the issue, whereas the conversation with the downstream, strangely, is more about waste management, health and safety, capacity to process, which obviously are very important and very critical, and still a step behind the global north, but are far from enough. And so it cannot be sufficient to only have this differentiation between upstream and downstream without understanding that we actually need to bring the two together. And that brings me to my closing point, which has two elements, one of them having to do with culture. What we're finding here is that in order to embed circular economy policies and that spirit of business modeling, especially in hard economic times, is we're having to go back to the original and intuitive and indigenous understanding of what circularity is. Because then talking about languages, you're much better able to communicate and actually build business models around something that is intuitive to that culture. And I use silly examples like there's a very popular food that is eaten, it's called moi moi. Traditionally, that food is packaged in banana leaves, and bananas, as you know, grow very, very rampantly. So it was very possible, and it was also nutritional. Now, generally speaking, that food, which has to be cooked in the packaging, is packaged in plastics. And I don't need to say anything about the negative consequences on health, but also obviously the nuisance of that plastic. So moving away from something that was indigenous and normal actually moved us towards something that was environmentally unfriendly. And so there is a need to actually reinforce that communication. Likewise also, and this is my last point, in terms of cooperation and in terms of, you know, developing national roadmaps and also policies that work for trade between the EU and Africa, or EU and Nigeria in this particular instance, we need to bear in mind that on the one hand, enforcement in some jurisdictions is much lower than in other jurisdictions. So in other words, we cannot depend on only enforcement. Secondly, in terms of monitoring and tracking, the question of data paucity and data integrity is also a huge issue to take into cognizance, because we need to be able to track progress. So you can't do a waterfall approach to progressing things. You need to be, or we need to be more agile in the way that we evaluate and invent and reinvent this product design and the direction in which we're going, which means also, for instance, that when we're talking about the companies that we bear in mind, it may make sense to some extent to work with some multinational companies that actually are operating in the global north and in the global south, and try to create an alignment of policies so that what happens in one location actually also begins to apply from the other location. And it's one instance where actually business first, which is really the core of where trade happens. Trade doesn't happen actually in de facto status between countries. It's always the businesses that are enacting the trade on behalf of those countries. And so in that regard, you know, looking at business modeling and business redesign and business development, and therefore also trade and investment and the prospect of scale from that perspective, will actually be very exciting. We will be very positive, provided that we keep all of the nuances between the jurisdictions in mind.
Dr. Ndidi, this was absolutely brilliant. And I think that, talking about scale, talking about investment, talking about trade is exactly where we're going. And there's a perfect bridge over to Jasper Munier, because representing the private sector and really looking at product standards, regulation, etc. What do you need for your business that is circular to grow? What would be the ideal environment?
Yeah, thank you all for your very inspiring words and the well-prepared research that was presented. I feel the pressure on my shoulders representing the industry in that regard, but just to tell you a little bit more about what we do as Clariter, as the next generation petrochemical company based on chemical recycling. We are working with the plastic waste problem itself, which is, as you all know, a huge pandemic across around our globe. And as a Dutch, I can say that for many years, we dealt with developing countries as our landfill place to go, exporting our problem away from our site. But I think that that's also an interesting opportunity there. And I have heard the word of business models and economic opportunities many times. And I think what we have been doing is 19 years ago, this started in Poland with a professor named Bleriot, who addressed this plastic waste problem and said, listen, if I can take plastic waste and turn them into valuable products that we need on a daily basis, what would that do for opportunities? And throughout this 19-year endeavor, we are now at the point of having our full-scale plant in various jurisdictions. But again, it started in Poland and then it went to South Africa. And we have our first demo facility in South Africa, East London, South Africa, where we produce up to 1,000 tons annually based on plastic waste, which is a 100% drop-in for current fossil-based products. So we tackle multiple problems regarding our fossil fuels and our plastic waste problem and turn them into profit. And I think that is where the opportunity lies. If you see that you have the environment on the one hand, the technology and the backing of policy, and I'll get to that in a minute, that can be turned into profit. And then you close the loop. And if you can close the loop from a profit perspective, you create opportunity, you create opportunity for local economies, and you make sure that from a societal perspective, you can create a better job market, better environmental standards, and so forth, etc. Regarding this policy perspective, I think that the EU, from where I can judge it, has a lighthouse position there. If you look at the Sustainable Product Initiative, the ESPR now called, I think that is very important in order to increase this opportunity based on, from where I'm sitting, the recycled content part. We make products based on plastic waste, and if this will be mandatory in the future for coatings, paints, oils, detergents, and so forth, that will be very helpful for many developing countries to turn this plastic pandemic into a business opportunity, and then exporting that to Europe. And many countries will follow. We see that already happening. And I think that from that perspective, there's a real opportunity to enhance a circular economy within the trade policy frameworks with these countries.
Thank you so much. Now I'll move to DG Trade. You've had a lot of input here. I guess from an EU perspective, the ESPR, the new product policy, is going ahead and there's a mixed response. I mean, there are a lot of companies that are saying we need these standards globally. And then there's a little bit of hesitance of, will they become a barrier to trade? So how do you look at standards for circularity? And do you see an opportunity to integrate discussions and work on standards within sort of your realm of operation at DG Trade, or is that something that would be more on the private sector side?
Thank you very much. I think we heard a lot of interesting information today. from the trade perspective, and I see you focus very much your question on standards.
Please feel free to also just have a general reaction.
I'll give you general remarks. I think several people have mentioned the panel on WTO in 2016. I haven't been there, but I've been in the WTO and environment field for the last year and a half, and I can tell you that a circular economy as a topic is really getting a lot of traction. And I think it is a topic that gets the traction both from developed and developing members. I think as in the WTO, we have a committee on trade and environment where members can share their experiences, and we can see increasing number of the presentations of the national measures in the committee. So EU is doing a lot of presentations linked to the European Green Deal, and we are actually this week are going to present our sustainable products initiative that has been published on the 30th of March and had been referred here several times. Developing countries are usually talking much more about restrictions on, for example, single-use plastics and other, I would say, more targeted initiatives that are there to, I think, reduce waste, because we really see a difficulty in managing the waste problem in the countries. And I think we heard also the possibility of opportunities and business opportunities in coming from management of waste. But I think, you know, we also need to be conscious that developing countries do not have infrastructure and capacities to benefit from those business opportunities, and they need the help and investment, as has been mentioned previously, in order to develop those business opportunities. So I think this is something important when we are developing policy and cooperation in the international context. In terms of setting standards, I mean, trade policy, I don't think, is a standard setting body. So we really need to rely on the other instances where we can work on the standards. In the context of structured discussions and the group in the WTO and the group on circularity, a few weeks ago, we've heard from a number of businesses speaking about importance of avoiding regulatory fragmentation internationally. And I think EU has gone quite far in setting standards, and I think this is great, and I think we should be able to set the standards and make sure that EU policies contribute to environmental protection. And but I think it is also important that we work together with our partners in making sure that they can follow us and then create those business opportunities for businesses that we have elsewhere. I think there was in the beginning of the presentation, Alina mentioned that EU trade policy doesn't mention per se in bilateral agreements, doesn't mention per se so much circular economy. While it is probably not explicitly mentioned, I mean, we are also looking in liberalizing services that contribute to circularity, for example, recyclability services. We also have goods that we are trying to reduce tariffs for recycled, remanufactured goods. We also have, I think we had discussed a lot about raw materials. We also have chapters on raw materials that is really promoting sustainable use of resources. So I think there is a platform. The Trade and Sustainable Development chapters speak about implementation of multilateral environmental agreements that are also relevant for circular economy, such as Basel, Rotterdam, Stockholm conventions. And I think most importantly, I think our bilateral agreements really offers a platform for cooperation. And I think Alina mentioned that that goes sometimes even beyond what we have written in the text, but really exchanges of our national policy frameworks, so European policy frameworks, including on circularity, that we have been doing with quite a number of EU trading partners.
Thank you. That serves well to show that a lot is going on different levels between EU and trading partners. Now I'd like to see whether there are questions in the room or in the chat. I think we have the chat being facilitated here at the end of the room, but also if somebody wants to ask or comment in the room, you're very welcome to do so. Or then we jump to questions.
I think there was a question. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. There was a question in the chat by Sibyl. She was asking how far can a plastic avoidance policy be considered? That is going back to packaging options, etc. options before the plastic avalanche.
Thank you. Did we have, maybe if there are a few questions, we can take a few of them and then every panelist could answer. And we have a question in the room as well.
Hi, thank you. Alex Braley from Sustainable Public Affairs. One EU policy document which came out with a big bang last December, but kind of attention has shifted away a bit in terms of circularity is the Sustainable Carbon Cycle communication. A lot of focus was, as predicted, on capture from air and carbon farming, so agriculture. But a really interesting part of that was at the end around the industrial sustainable carbon challenge for industry and how we're going to produce products that actually require carbon. We talk a lot about decarbonization, but what we really need to do is defossilize. So I was wondering if the panel could share their views on how Europe, through circularity, can help meet that objective, particularly the one I think it's specified that by 2030, 20% of chemicals and plastic products should be used with recycled sustainable carbon rather than virgin carbon. Thank you.
Thank you for that technical question as well.
Yes.
And Antoine, you're passing around the mic. Or otherwise, let's see if we have another question from the chat box. Yeah, my apologies. I can't see the questions in the chat box, so I'm a bit reliant. This is one of the hybrid events that we're testing out how it works.
There was a question at the beginning of the panel discussion on EU e-waste trade, but I think it was answered. How is it possible to ship waste to Nigeria? If the e-waste is from EU products shipped for reuse, can we require that EU EPR fees follow the EU export of products for reuse?
Okay, thank you. So I would invite actually all panelists, one in a row, to answer a question that would seem appropriate to you, but also if there are any other comments that you want to make on the basis of your co-panelists.
Yeah, let me start off with the last remark on export of waste and export of plastics in particular. Of course, I think that what you see now, and you see clearly with the policy that China imposed a few years ago on the export ban of plastic. I think that is a good start. I mean, we have to make sure that we clean our own mess, if you will, in that regards. And I think that exactly what Alex is trying to address with sustainable carbon communication is that basically what we see is that if we make sure that our policies are more bolder in that respect regarding recycled content, sustainable carbons, we can hit a few of these milestones or targets and with one blow with one stone, whether it's waste, whether it's carbons, fossil carbons, and making sure that we create an equilibrium of better trade possibilities with developing countries. So in that respect, I would think that the plastic pandemic itself is a very, very clear starting point because we all encounter this fact. And from a product design perspective, make sure that we use less plastics. I mean, I think that is very important to stress. Of course, we've seen a quadrupling in the usage of plastics over the past 10 years, 20 years. That should stop at one hand. And then again, more downstream, how do we tackle that and create and close the loop in these business opportunities? Again, of course, like was mentioned, we need to make sure that the investments, the local investments are there and made possible. But the business case can only fly if there is coherent policy throughout member states, throughout the EU and other countries that make sure that export is possible. And I think our example of our demonstration plant in South Africa, which is backed by the South African government, clearly states that they foresee this as a business opportunity themselves, seeing to create a new export opportunity for the country, which basically lacks these export opportunities themselves because they have not so much for to export. So I think that is a very clear example of how you can combine these three different goals.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, I won't ignore your question, but I will admit up front that I'm not equipped to answer it. It was a bit too technical. Sorry about that. A few comments that arose from the discussion. It's been mentioned a few times that there's no explicit mention of circular economy in FTAs, and that is true most of the time. But if I'm not mistaken, the Vietnam EU one, the New Zealand EU one that are currently being negotiated do mention circular economy explicitly. And I think the Australian one, which is waiting to be ratified, does as well. Having said that, if you look at the WTO measures over the last decade, I think somebody's counted at least 370 measures that were relevant to circular economy. And so the question is then, do you make that explicit, or do you just consider that it's part of the mainstream and this is where we should be going? And that could be interesting. I think it's good to highlight the fact that they are conducive to circular economy, even if they don't mention it. So there's a bit of a nuance here. When it comes to the technical support, there are support mechanisms that do exist at global level as well. And the WTO created Aid for Trade. The EU and the member states are the biggest contributors to that program, which means that if you make circular economy explicit in that very efficient and already existing mechanism that does channel funds and technical support, then you can reinforce it without having to create anything new. The trade in raw materials, which is not always a question of circularizing those value chains, it's important to acknowledge as well that it has tripled over the past 2 decades, if I'm not mistaken, from 95 billion to over 300 billion tons per year. And that again is a sign of those value chains changing somewhat due to a variety of external pressures and economic opportunities as well. And in that context, I think we're moving gradually from seeing circular economy as a waste management issue to something which is more holistic, as Antoine was saying, and looking at materials management more so than waste management. In that sense, the Circular Economy Action Plan adopted in March 2020 has an international dimension, which is a difference compared to the previous one. And it explicitly mentions that the EU member states should stop exporting their waste to other countries. That's probably as well a reaction to the China implementing the national salt policy, which saw a dramatic reduction in plastic exports. And finally, the interesting thing is to see that going back to China, the EU and China signed an MOU on circular economy in July 2018. It's very embryonic, but it does point to specific measures that relate to upstream, and that could potentially create the basis for product standards, circular product standards at global level. Because of course, if you have provisions for putting stuff on the market that is circular, both in the EU and China, I wonder who would be foolish enough to produce something that doesn't fit on either of those.
So I don't think I can answer the question on decarbonization either. But I think from the broader perspective, I mean, EU is really leading in terms of decarbonization and neutrality efforts globally. We have our Fit for 55 package that encompasses enormous amount of initiatives. And I think one of those you mentioned is actually part of the second part of that package. I think overall, I think there is a commitment also to not only in Paris Agreement, but I think also in the EU to reduce fossil fuel subsidies, to decarbonize our industries. We have partly as a response to Ukraine and Russia crisis, we have also published a Repower EU strategy that is also making EU's energies more sustainable, diversifying our efforts. So I think EU is really trying to decarbonize, and that I think also goes a little bit into the questions of the product design that we have mentioned today. I think the eco design for sustainable products is also looking into footprint of the products. So there is a lot of effort in the EU to lead by the example. But what I wanted to stress as well, I mean, we are not alone in the world, and we are relying also for inputs and for a lot of production also of our trading partners. So we need to make sure that while we lead by the example, we also make sure we are following that example. And I think international cooperation, and not only in the trade context, but overall, is very important in terms of setting the global standards that allows for a level playing field for the businesses as well within the world. I mean, we cannot, if we are imposing the very specific product standards, it also makes it more complicated for some businesses in developing countries to comply. I think we heard that earlier today. I think the mangoes example was one of them. So I think it is really important that we also work cooperation. I think there were several examples mentioned in terms of EU having global alliances. I think there is one of them on circular economy and resource efficiency. We partnered with quite a few partners in the world. So I think it is important we continue to support. We also continue to support efforts for international standardization, because it is also easier to develop policies in that regard, national policies that help businesses export, import globally. In the Committee on Trade and Environment, we really, in the WTO, we try to make sure that we provide transparency as much as possible of what we are doing in Europe. Hopefully also giving some ideas for the partners there so that they can follow our example. I think in terms of international cooperation and referencing the plastics in particularly, informal dialogue on plastics in WTO is really looking beyond the setting standards. It's also looking into cooperation, for example, between WTO and World Customs Organization in terms of identifying trade in plastics, because I think first step in understanding where the plastics are going and how we can handle them is really to understand, okay, so how do we trade with plastics? And a lot of plastics trade is actually hidden plastics trade behind packaging of the materials or even containers. I think another important element as well, I think we heard Emma mentioned the two global processes. So one was an informal dialogue on plastics, and then the other IEEP agreement on global agreement for plastics. And there, I think we are also trying to ensure that there is a coherent approach between what we are doing in the WTO and so how our work can actually feed in helping these global efforts to reduce plastics and how trade policy can really contribute in addressing this plastics trade globally.
Thank you so much, and I'll hand over to the virtual part of our panel. So Dr. Ndidi.
Okay, thank you. I see that we're all kind of struggling with that very technical question, the industrial sustainable carbon challenge. So I will also just say a few words about that. And my thought in that regard is, you know, I really like the comment that was made about materials management. It's not about waste management, it's about materials management, and that kind of speaks to that theme. And one of the things we haven't explicitly talked about is that question of carbon sequestration. So at least this part of the world, and I want to raise that idea of, for instance, if we're able to put a value to, so one of the things we're talking about at the moment on this end regarding the plastics value chain is tokenizing the plastics. So again, Global South, a big part of our economy is actually informal. And so all of these conversations we're having actually fly way over the head of the informal sector, which in some instances constitutes 65% of the economy. So we've got to bring them in if we're really talking about circularity and climate action being carried by the people. So when you talk about, for instance, the computer village, it's huge, it's the largest in Africa, but it's informal. And so, you know, having been involved in the microfinance sector for the last 23 years, I know that with the right level of effort, not that we're there yet, you can actually get to the point where, one, you're putting a value. How do we put a value to these plastics? And how do we measure actually and incentivize, you know, plastics collection and aggregation and actually moving them into use and reuse or redeployment as part of a materials management value chain by thinking about it differently. And I want to point to the fact that businesses have a very important role to play in that regard. And if I think of the example, again, going back to that question of, you know, carbon sequestration or sustainable carbon challenge, right now, talking about fossil fuels, which is a big no-no, the large international oil companies are selling down their assets, and they're selling down their assets to indigenous companies. Well, if they don't sell them, they're at risk of becoming stranded assets. So technically speaking, what's happening is that we're selling down an asset that has not taken into cognizance all of the negative externalities and impacts and the damage that it's had on the environment, which the newer companies are actually going to be made accountable for. So their business model and their business accounting is going to change significantly. So the question I ask, therefore, is, are we properly even valuing those assets that are being sold down? And to what extent do the international oil companies and international multinationals have to be brought to account in terms of internalizing some of those negative externalities, or at least taking some responsibility for, you know, supporting new business models that solve that problem going forward? Or does that end the minute the asset is sold down? Because that raises all kinds of question marks and creates a certain duplicity if we're then going to create standards that these countries are going to be held accountable to. Again, I was saying that there are interesting ideas around that. For example, we're exploring the idea of plus tokens that essentially mean that you could get value out of these plastics, because the truth is, in Germany, you have a system called Pfand. I know it's all over Europe. So consumers are actually interested in returning their plastics, but with a weak waste management infrastructure, that is very difficult. So you almost have to have a situation where the businesses that are going to use the plastics are driving the collection therefrom. I want to talk to two other points very quickly. One of them being just going back to that question of carbon sequestration, carbon sinks, and land. Again, from a culture point of view, I heard the previous speaker say it's important that as Europe, we clean up our own mess. I agree with that, but also what we need to do is we need to actually ask ourselves, what were the ways in which messes were cleaned up wherever they were? And how do we make sure that those are not eroded in the name of modernization? And I'll give an example. So in my traditional culture, we had parts of the forest that we called sacred forests. And those sacred forests were not touched. It was part of the culture. It was part of the belief system. It was part of the value system, because there was, not because there's a legislation or because there's a global movement on climate action, but because for the people that are there who consider people, planet, and profit to coexist side by side, it was important. That's an important consideration to take into view. How exactly one does it, I'm not sure, but it speaks to that question of development cooperation. One of the speakers prior to me talked about it's important to set these standards and that the Global South follows. And I want to argue that it's not important that the Global South follows, but that it co-creates some of these standards. That's so absolutely critical. Otherwise, we'll have a catch-up mechanism that won't actually work. because it's an imposition or it's so far removed from where they're coming. And I find it very interesting also in that regard, and this kind of speaks to that question of, you know, plastic avoidance policy or policies and standards in general. It's fascinating that actually we're saying that circular economy is not explicitly called out in a lot of the EU policies that are being made, because circular economy, at least from the way that we see it, is one thing that stands a very, very good chance of aligning economy and environment and social impact all in one. It's just such a powerful business remodeling tool that creates jobs and creates opportunities and creates new businesses, and actually has the opportunity for a whole new avalanche, talking about avalanche of trade, because it's a place where actually businesses that don't have the technology can partner with businesses that do have the technology and make it work in a local environment and make it effective. So in that regard, I think that, you know, the new standards, including the International Sustainability Standards Board that is being evolved, IFRAG, and all of the other guidelines and standards that are being put up for sustainability, do need to take that co-creation process and consultative process very, very much into view. And in that regard, to look at circular economy really not from an upstream, downstream point of view, but from, and this is my landing point, from a design problem perspective, so that innovation and research and development and the data and the learning that goes with that learning loop are absolutely critical in terms of this particular conversation that we're having.
Thank you so much. And that sort of brilliantly actually pulls together a number of issues, because we're at the end of our time. I won't say more than just a few words, but I mean, it's been such a rich debate that you can't really summarize everything here, but it is very much about value creation, about economic opportunity. And at the same time, we're moving towards a more regulated environment, because without that, we can't address living within planetary boundaries. And this project has also brought out some of those tensions. Who's the leader? Who's the follower? Neither. We do have to co-create. And so many of the good examples also during this panels have come around ideas like culture, about the sacred forests, about a lot of issues that in every single culture is available. And while we focus on technical standards and regulations and getting those right, it's important not to forget sort of what we already have and what we can leverage that is beyond the technical work that needs to be done. And there's a lot that has to be done. And then we can, you know, pull it together in a trade context as well. So no mean feat, but we have the work set out and we'll be continuing. So thank you so much to IEEP, panelists, partners, and I look forward to continuing the work in this or different contexts. Thank you, and thank you to the people who are on the online part of the webinar as well.